Is journalism dead? Well, this week was supposed to be filled with discourse on the most comprehensive report on the depravities committed by Hamas on October 7th. However, thanks to a well-timed New York Times opinion piece, the discourse quickly derailed into classic Israel-Palestine finger-pointing. This is The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. On Tuesday, thousands of users worldwide woke up to a harrowing report by the Civil Commission on October 7th crimes by Hamas against women and children. Containing over 300 pages, the report doesn't only just map out the use of sexual violence as a systematic tool of war, but also the use of the torture of family members to inflict additional psychological terror. However, the discourse was short-lived as another report made the rounds from the New York Times claiming essentially the same thing, but on the other end, including a claim of the systematic use of Israeli rape dogs on Palestinian prisoners. Here to discuss this, we're joined with the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, Ruth Marks Eglash. Ruth, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So this was a very tough week. There were, some heavy topics and some unfortunate discourse on social media. Most notably, there was the report on the systematic use of sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th, which you interviewed the researchers extensively and you had conversations about that, as well as a rather unfortunately timed op-ed by the New York Times, which kind of almost shift the narratives, as in saying that, no, it's actually Israel that does this to Palestinians. So that's what I want to talk about today. The first thing I want to do is I want to actually discuss the report itself, because I think it's important, and I think we have a duty not to let it get overshadowed by online discourse and everything else, and make sure that this story gets told. So, report Hamas's use of sexual violence in a systematic way, not just on October 7th, but also throughout the entirety of Hamas, the hostages' captivity. What did you talk about? What did you see?
So I do want to start by how this report was received when it came out, and I'll say many journalists who are based here in Israel had the report already for at least a few weeks before it came out, and it was under an embargo. And then people who had interviewed Kochav El-Kayam Levy, who's the chair of the Civil Commission on October 7th atrocities, gave some interviews, and people then published their story. So the fact that this came out and caused such a storm reminded me of the early days after October 7th, when the discussion first came up that Hamas, as well as committing the atrocities, killing people, infiltrating into Israel, all of that stuff, on top of all of that, it came out that they had committed sexual crimes, sexual violence, or sexual terrorism. And even then, that part of the debate triggered so many people and triggered such a fierce debate. And I remember myself, after October 7th, reporting or even suggesting on social media that maybe sexual crimes took place and being attacked by
and some of them were live streamed.
Some of them were live streamed, and for me, it was I never had a question. Was never a question in my mind that would have happened. I mean, you saw the images from the Nova Festival, for example, and I think when I interviewed Kochav El-Kayam Levy the other day, she also spoke about this. The terrorists that infiltrated Israel on October 7th, they arrived in people's houses. It was the early morning. People were in their pajamas. They were in a very vulnerable state of dress, or they'd just come out of their bed, which makes someone much more vulnerable. And the same with the Nova Festival. People were in, party clothes, which are a little bit more risque, because you kind of you want to dress up when you go out to a party like that. So it was never a question in my mind that happened. And I remember around 6 weeks after the October 7th, there being this police briefing, and the police explaining, we were in such a state of shock on October 7th and in the days afterwards at the amount of people who had been murdered. And we were dealing with, we're still fighting some of the terrorists that had infiltrated.
Right,
and there was battles going on the street, and they were removing dead bodies from from the corners of roads and roadsides and cars, that they didn't do the due diligence of collecting, evidence of rape.
Right.
But it never crossed my mind to question that it happened. It seemed to me very obvious when you have a group of guys with guns and they have the power that they would have used sexual violence as a way to wield their terror.
Right.
So for me, it was never a question. And what happened yesterday reminded me of that debate over did it happen, didn't it happen?
Right. And I mean, I think we've seen like upticks of this kind of throughout the war too, because, a lot of people who are in denial and skeptical of the sexual violence always, they make this claim that like there's no live testimony, obviously, because a lot of them were killed. But then, we had hostages come back in deals and, very bravely they gave their testimony. And, so we have living people who are giving their testimony. And it was kind of met with the same.
Every time someone spoke about it, from Omid Sosana, the hostage, who I think was the first who actually spoke about.
She spoke at the UN,
the sexual violence that she endured, to a New York Times, and we'll talk about the New York Times again in a minute, but the New York Times had a big story about the woman in the black dress and who was she, and within that there was also testimony that she had been sexually assaulted or even raped. And throughout the last 2.5 years, this has come up again and again and again, also from male hostages when they came back from Gaza. And every single time, there's this furious debate and denial that goes with it. And it just seems to be such a triggering issue for everyone. And I, for myself, have always wondered why this is so triggering. Maybe because an element of this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has a religious element to it. And when you think of religion, you think, okay, well, sex doesn't go with religion. But, obviously there's all different elements that go into this conflict as well. So
the sex, there's a taboo around it. There's this hypercharged kind of this like dichotomy of like always having like a us versus them and superiority complex. Like there's a million different explanations.
No, but I also think historically, if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's been many waves of violence, ups and downs. Things that have happened. Things that have happened from both sides. And the sexual element was never such a big issue. And this is the first time in the last 2.5 years that it's become a big issue. And I remember myself reading about different terror attacks, even in the first Intifada, and learning about, in some of them, there was sexual violence. And being very shocked because it's something that people didn't really talk about before.
Right.
And now, this time, as you said, they filmed it themselves and it was obvious
that
it happened.
I know this doesn't apply to everyone, but I remember on the day of October 7th, I was unfortunate to just be in a bunch of like Telegram groups and WhatsApp groups that, again, Hamas, they were not only killing people, they were stealing their phones, they were live streaming things. And I saw them live stream terrible things. And amid those terrible things, I saw people who weren't fully clothed. So like it wasn't
Right.
I understand, I appreciate that's not something everyone has the kind of anecdotal kind of experience of, but like you said, it never occurred to me that this is even a topic of debate. Like of course it did.
Yeah.
But what's insane and shocking about the report isn't the fact that like it proves that it happened with all this like compounding evidence. It highlights that it was like a key core of the strategy, not just on the day of, but again all throughout the war. Like long as there were Israelis in captivity, this was like a key, super important policy that they continue to implement.
So I think you're right. I mean, for me, the report didn't tell me anything I didn't know. I've interviewed a handful of the hostages that came back who spoke about it with me.
Yeah.
I've heard testimony from other released hostages who spoke about it. I saw the footage like you did on October 7th and the days afterwards. So it was always, I wasn't surprised by what was in the report as much as how it showed a pattern. And I think that's what is so important about this report. And Kochav, when I interviewed her, she spoke about this being a watershed report. And I believe that to be true because now we have a fuller picture. If 6 weeks after October 7th, things were still sketchy and maybe evidence hadn't been totally collected and the rape kits weren't used on October 7th and people who had witnessed or experienced sexual violence hadn't come forward and spoken about it yet because they were still in shock. Today, 2.5 years later, they have put this report together, and I think that it shows the systematic how the sexual violence was used systematically, and also the scope of it. That it
Yeah.
happened in so many places, not just at the Nova. When we think about the Nova, that might be the most obvious place, but it happened in the kibbutzim, and it happened on the roads around the south where people were murdered. So I think that that's where the report makes everything come together and why it's so important.
Yeah, my two takeaways from this report. I haven't finished reading it its entirety. I'm like a little over halfway through, but my two main takeaways really are when I go through this report, it reminds me of when I visited Poland. Like I did a trip of like not only just the concentration camps, but where Jewish communities used to live. And I remember going on this trip thinking I'm gonna get a lot of answers on the Holocaust and a better understanding. And what it really did is, while I did understand more and I had more knowledge than when I went in, it just clarified for me just how massive this was, and how much I really don't know, how wide scale it really is, and how we sometimes we can't actually even really comprehend this much. So that's the first thing that I have to take away. And the second thing is this watershed moment you describe. It also reminds me about how the Nuremberg trials weren't just mass prosecutions. It was like this whole framework in order to set legal pathways to prosecute for things that were actually this bad. Because it's one thing to be able to recognize that, okay, what happened here was really bad. It's also a problem when you don't have the legal frameworks to be able to prosecute on such a mass scale for things that are so atrocious. So I do think this has the potential, and I hope this becomes one of those watershed moments where this removes the kind of stopgaps in order to bring justice, because international law wasn't built for things this horrendous. So I hope this leads to that. And yeah, I think we're all just really stunned. As you said, we all know what happened on October 7th, but at the same time we just keep learning every day more and more about how terrible it was, how much we don't know, and just how important it is that things like this continue to be published, and the whole quest for bringing stuff to light continues.
Yeah, and I mean, I have been speaking to Kohav since the first few weeks after October 7th. I don't remember the first time I spoke to her, and I think that she was just so persistent and consistent with this. She refused to give up, and she spoke in front of the most hostile audiences. She spoke at the UN, and she spoke in other places, and she took a lot of abuse and heat online, but she kept on going and kept on going. And I think two incredible things for me anyway, or two things that struck me about this report. One is that she talked about how it has really helped the families or the victims, the families of the victims, the survivors, the people that came and told their stories to her and shared with her their what they witnessed. This report has really kind of helped them work through everything and give them some hope that people are listening. And the other thing is that her and her team coined this concept of kinocide.
Right.
And for people who are listening, if you don't know, kinocide is this idea that you can wield terror through families, through terrorizing family members and creating, or carrying out violence.
The subjugation
against,
it creates a new element of psychological terror.
Psychological terror against family members, some of them in the presence of family members. And that was also a huge revelation for me when she spoke about how in some of the cases they saw that relatives were made to perform sex acts in front of one another.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that it's much harsher when you see your own family member, your relative, your father killed in front of you, your daughter killed in front of you. That kind of terrorism that didn't have a name before this.
Right. It didn't have a name, and therefore it's harder to actually to prosecute. Is a thing
process and prosecute.
Yeah, you tend to assume that all these different structures and bodies have, international law has these kinds of things in mind, and then you're just taken by surprise that in fact it's so atrocious that they never bothered to write it down on paper. So,
but it's something so obvious that maybe it just because
right.
She also spoke about how when she was working, when the idea struck her that when she saw it laid out in front of her that this had been prevalent on October 7th, she spoke to other lawyers, other legal advisors around the world who dealt with different conflicts. And she found that it happened in, the ISIS had carried it out for the Yazidis,
Right.
that it happened in Sudan, in Rwanda, in other places. And she realized that it was a phenomenon that just had never been coined, that had never
Been like codified,
named.
really. Yeah.
Yeah, codified. Exactly.
It's absolutely insane. I really don't know what else could be said about it. I recommend people read it.
Yeah.
It's not easy. I think, you should know yourself, and if you know you're not going to take it, well, it's going to do bad for you, things for you, then maybe don't read it. But it's like, if you can stomach it, I think if there's like a report that one should read about October 7th, it should be this, because I think at the end of the day, like, this is the most important one, and it's really, really heavy stuff. But then, because it's Israel and we can't just have things go in, linear ways and have discussion and discourse about it, we then have to talk about the New York Times op-ed. So to kind of like put some background about this, as you said, a lot of news outlets were aware of this report a few weeks ahead of time, in some cases months ahead of time, in order to like prepare and get everything ready.
Read it, 300 pages.
Right, to read it and
process
prepare it
Yeah.
exactly, so that on the day of for publication, everything would be ready to go. And one of the publications that received this was the New York Times.
Yeah. We assume. I mean, everyone received it.
Yeah,
so-
everyone and their mother received it, so one must assume that they had these two. Interestingly enough, they didn't publish something on the report at the same time as all the other outlets. CNN got it first, and then kind of all the outlets that were briefed on it were allowed to publish it, when they were able to publish it. And then anyone who didn't know about it kind of wrote it up as like a news report, like, oh, this just came out, this is what it says, et cetera, et cetera. But the New York Times did something interesting, which was the day before. I'm going to call it a report, but, it was classified as an op-ed, in big bold letters. It was written as opinion. It was featured on the opinion section and has an opinion tag. But a, almost 4,000 word report column came out about essentially the same thing, but just from the side of Israel. As in, it was a report with testimony about the amount of sexual abuse and violence that goes on towards Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli prison system. And again, this was published the day before, so it had a whole 24 hours on the news cycle, and it happened to come out, the day before the big publication of this report. Yeah. I have many opinions on this, but I'll let you talk about.
Listen. Was it a coincidence? Was it on purpose? I mean, you and I both work in a in a newsroom, and even though we're all meant to be very good at communicating, sometimes communication doesn't happen. So,
Absolutely.
we have to give the benefit of the doubt that that the opinion section of the New York Times was not aware that that the Civil Commission in Israel was about to publish this massive, 300-page report. What intrigues me most about the article that was in the New York Times, and I don't want to call it a report because it was, as you said, published as an opinion piece. Therefore, it should be taken as an opinion piece. If it was a bona fide report, then the news section would have taken it and published it. I'm assuming. I mean, I've worked for one of the big newspapers in America, and it seems, and it's true that opinion writers do research. They don't just sit down and write their opinion.
Of course.
They go and they research and they talk to people. But at the end of the day, they admit that it's an opinion. Okay, that it's a perspective,
Right?
And it's not like they're
This is
presenting
fact or this is
facts,
data. Yeah.
right. That they're presenting a perspective. But the piece that was in the New York Times, written by Nicholas Kristof, he presented it as a reporting project, as deep research, and it's even even has a dateline from the West Bank. So I'm assuming that he came here, he came to Israel, he went to the Palestinian territories, and he interviewed Palestinians. He researched, he found ex-prisoners. So I'm assuming that he went through the Palestinian Prisoners Association, because I don't know how else. I mean, I've been a journalist here for 30 years. I don't know how else you would find Palestinian prisoners unless he walked around Ramallah and different cities in the West Bank and asked people if they had been prisoners and just happened to strike luck. I'm assuming that it was some sort of organization helped him reach those
Right.
people. And
Which,
that
by the way,
happened to
is
be them.
fine, and we'll get to Christoph in a minute.
and it's
that's,
totally fine.
That's how one should conduct a report.
What
But
was so frustrating yesterday was that it was an opinion piece. Was it a report? Was it his view, or was it, really deeply researched? And
right.
and I also have to say, Jake, we have to accept on a certain level, tempers of, feelings have been running very high in Israel since October 7th. People are very upset exactly by the information that we just discussed that was in the report. Many of these Palestinian prisoners were jailed after October 7th for their role in the atrocities. So, there isn't a lot of compassion for Palestinian prisoners in Israel and in the prison system. Especially.
Absolutely.
I mean, find me a prison officer who has any compassion for the people that they are guarding. I'm very doubtful that there is, maybe here and there.
Right.
So I'm assuming that there was definitely levels of abuse, maybe even sexual violence, and maybe even rape. As we've heard testimonies from some of the Palestinian prisoners. But the way he presented it as it being a systematic, i.e. a decision of the Israeli government, was very frustrating, and also peddling this idea that dogs are able to be trained
Right.
to rape human beings was just, that's what we've got used to conspiracy theorists talking about. So to hear it from a New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning
Right.
columnist was a little shocking.
Yeah. So for me, there's a lot to unpack here on so many levels. I think I'll go least to most egregious. I think makes the most sense in my head. So when we're talking about the New York Times role, I just think, again, we don't know exactly what happened. We have to give some kind of benefit of the doubt. So I think at the bare minimum, we can all agree it's just a massive oversight. Not only that this was classified just as an opinion piece, but despite the fact that it was an opinion piece, it was featured so prominently on the website. A big part of my job is dealing with our website and how things are placed. And opinion pieces don't mistakenly end up featured as prominently as they do on the homepage at the top section of websites. It just doesn't happen that way. Like most things that are put there with intent. And we haven't even talked about the fact that in addition to the op-ed report, whatever you want to call it, there was also a feature video that I don't know if they produced or he produced himself, but it was uploaded in addition to it, and it was also featured very prominently. So if one stumbled onto the New York Times, they were hit in the face with not only this quote-unquote op-ed that was in the slots of the very big international news stories, but they also had a feature video to go with it. So I don't know if I entirely buy that it was just, miscommunication and incompetence and whoopsie. It's hard for me to buy that, but let's say I do. This was handled very, 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 very poorly, and I think we can all safely say that the damage was done, even if that was the case. The headline was out there, people saw it, people didn't question it. The fact that it's placed prominently on the New York Times speaks volumes to the headline, which it gives it a sense of prominence that it shouldn't necessarily be given. There's also a side note, but people on Twitter were saying that they're talking to people in the New York Times who are discussing getting rid of Nick Kristof, to which the New York Times responded saying this is absolutely not true. Right. But in that they also said he reported, so I don't know if it's a report or an op-ed. I think it's absolutely a report, not an op-ed, but that's my qualm with the New York Times. I think somewhere along the line there was someone who was well aware of the report because the timing is so coincidental. And I think it's specifically a piece not just about, it's not just about testimonies of mistreatment and assault of prisoners. It's, as you said, this systematic element. It feels too coincidental. But that's what I have to say about the New York Times.
I mean, I always feel, there's much legitimate criticism of Israel, but if you want that criticism of Israel to be effective, then it has to be presented in a certain way. And this is such a sensitive topic. So why, if the research and the testimonies are airtight,
Right, if
why
it's
doesn't
solid.
the New York Times take it and say they carried out many investigations. They carried out investigations into incidents that happened in Gaza.
When they
and
did the woman in the black dress, it wasn't an op-ed.
exactly
It was a report.
No, but they've carried out, I don't know, investigations where they use mapping and they use,
Right.
open source, information. And they say, we've done this in big investigation into, I think they did something on the ambulances. Remember the incident with
Of course,
the ambulances in Gaza? So why, if this was an airtight, solid report,
Then why hide behind op-ed?
Yeah, why put it in the op-ed section? I understand that he is a columnist, but he surely knows the editors
Of course.
of the New York Times, and he could have said, I have this amazing story. The interviews I did were very compelling. Let's put it out as an investigative piece, and then it will be airtight. And maybe then Israel and Israelis would take it seriously,
Yeah.
rather than feel like
That also poses the alternative that if the sourcing and the testimony isn't airtight, which is like its own strand of discourse, because some of the testimony collected were from like these NGOs that are like very not credible. We have articles on like Euromed and how like things that they lied about in the past and how they've gotten like second or third hand testimony from people who don't actually know. It's like that in itself is like its own discussion. But then the question becomes, if the sourcing isn't so airtight, if the testimony isn't so deemable in the way that like the New York Times is happy to put it as a report, not an op-ed, then why put it up so irresponsibly?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the bigger question, because either you stand by this entirely and it's a report, or you're not so sure, but then, I don't think Nick Kristof has access to the New York Times website and just uploaded it himself. I think he submitted it, had to go through editors, it had to go through at least a few pairs of eyes who approved it. So at some point the decision was made to approve it in the form that it is, but also call it an op-ed because we're not sure if we can call it a report because we're afraid of the backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, there's the issue of the claims itself. So first of all, I think, absolutely, as you said, there's definitely abuse of prisoners in the prison system. And
abuse of prisoners that are not being investigated.
Absolutely.
And people are not being prison officers who have carried out the abuse are not being held accountable for what they've done, or they're even being, blind eyes being turned to what they're doing.
Listen, it's and this is just my opinion, but I really think like that there's not enough investigation going on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not to turn this into like a whole, to spark like a debate of my own, but I think if we look at like what happened in State Taiman, that just shows how complicated the whole investigating into like the treatment of prisoners really is. And at the same time, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir is openly happy about how he's making conditions for prisoners worse and worse and worse day by day. That's like essentially his real.
That was his stated goal.
Yeah.
When he came into that.
That's
position.
like his platform, and if not part of it.
And
like,
I have spent quite a few hours interviewing released Palestinian prisoners before October 7th,
right,
who, were obviously being in prison is never a pleasant experience,
of course,
but they, through the years, were able to, study at Open University, get their master's degrees, have an open canteen where they can, buy whatever they wanted, had medical care, and were more or less free. I mean, we've all known this for years, that there's not much monitoring of Palestinian prisoners. They're kind of like in their own, they have their own kind of, or up until October 7th, they had their own system of governance within the prison system.
Right, and again, that's not necessarily, it's synonymous with abuse. Obviously, like that's a whole separate thing, but I think it's no surprise that, and also, as you said, especially after October 7th, there's like a lack of sympathy, which is like one of the most important elements when you have, it's like security guards overseeing prisoners. Obviously, like if you view the prisoners as like less than human, I'm not surprised that abuse is taking place, and it should happen. But again, there's a big reach and a big claim to go from there are Palestinian prisoners being abused and like not enough is being done about it, to this portfolio of systematic degradation and dog rape that was presented in the column.
But if you read that column, like it doesn't, I mean, like, you have this headline and insinuates that it's systematic, and he starts off by citing the Euromed report, But if you read further down, he himself writes that it's very hard to prove it.
Right.
And he even interviews Sari Bashi, a Israeli-American human rights lawyer, who talks about how it's not systematic, although says that with the current minister in charge and the way things and the current environment in Israel, that these things probably happen, but they're not prosecuted or they're not challenged.
Right. But then when we get to this, like it's almost a shame really that like the timings here, because yesterday on social media, the discourse on the sexual violence report almost completely disappeared. No one really talked about it, except for in the context of actually Israel's doing it because of the timing of this report. So I think it's a shame that it almost got erased, and it's why it's important for that. I thought we talk about it, but
both issues are really important and both should be accepted, and two things can be true at the same time. But I'm saying, like, to get someone to take something seriously
and to frame it as systematic, and then by own admission to be like, but actually I'm not sure. I think it's clear to everyone involved that it's just they knew it could do more harm than good, and it went up anyway. So I don't know. I think it's, I'm not really sure what his motivations were. I don't want to, conspiratorialize about, who this person is and like his vendetta against Israel if he has one. But I do think, when you're a news outlet, an international news outlet, and you have an opportunity to have a headline that implies Israel did something bad, it's going to generate clicks. That no matter what you end up doing, it'll bring discussion. And I think, especially the New York Times doesn't always, give that the weight it deserves. We also saw earlier this week, now it's obviously the implications like nowhere near as heavy, but they published a report on Eurovision and how Israel is influencing the vote. And their finding was that Israel advertises to vote for the candidate, which is not against the rules, as is every other country. And the real finding here was that just people don't pay to vote for Eurovision, but they framed it in a way that was, Israel is cooking the books. And that also came out right before Eurovision, before, he performed the song and got into the final. So, like, it's hard not to feel that it's coincidental that in the same week, two events before there were publications that were supposed to give any credence to, like, Israel's success or the issues that Israel are facing, there had to kind of be, like, a counter-narrative. And I don't know. I think it's insane. I think it's really unfortunate that outlets don't think of the damage that they do when these headlines go out. But I think ultimately it's just important that as readers, people are aware that maybe don't just latch onto a headline, actually read it, critically think, come to our conclusion, even if it means sifting through 3,000 words. If you can get to the bottom where the author says, I can't actually prove this though, that makes it all the worthwhile. And I don't know. So I think it was a bitter week for journalism, but at the same time, I think it was a good week for the truth because we had reports like the sexual violence come out.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are my thoughts. If you have, what's your take?
I don't know. On the Eurovision, it's just it should just be a music competition. And, I've heard these claims that Israel manipulated the voting last year and the popular voting and. It's the Eurovision.
Moroccan oil, yeah, no.
Eurovision is about fun and I don't know if you watched it last night, but the costumes were wacky and crazy and like that's what Eurovision is. Like, who cares? Yeah. I don't know why that had to be even a story. So.
Yeah, but here we are. Well, yeah. So that was this week in journalism. I hope this will lead to a change. I'm skeptical, but. This is really just a reminder of, how much damage a headline can do and how important it is that, people read responsibly. And I hope for, like, the New York Times' sake, at least, that they, even if this wasn't a malicious, like, act, it at least wakes them up to really put eyes on anything related to Israel when it comes to publishing, how it's being published, how it's being presented, what are the claims, is this airtight, can we stand by it? If we can't stand by it, how much credence are we going to give it? But I guess only time will tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see. But thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's all for this week's episode. Remember, read news responsibly, and visit jpost.com to stay up to date on the latest on Israel and the Middle East.